A poor little girl ran into a restaurant and interrupted a billionaire's dinner. Instead of getting angry, he immediately went to the hospital to get him checked with her. The city sparkled beyond the glass like a stage lit for a play Thomas Bradford had grown tired of watching. From the penthouse-level dining room at Le Mirabeau, Manhattan stretched endlessly, a mosaic of lights and sharp edges. Inside, candlelight danced lazily on polished cutlery and wine glasses, casting long shadows across the white linen tablecloth. The violinist near the far wall played something soft, something forgettable. Thomas sat still, his posture perfect, his charcoal suit unwrinkled. He stared at the menu as though it offended him. Across from him, Jason flipped through a digital tablet, voice measured, reciting tomorrow's investor agenda as if he were reading a weather forecast. And Gregson from Avalon Capital is still pushing for the Riverside contract to be prioritized. They want preliminary designs by... Thomas raised his hand, not to interrupt, but as if swatting away a mosquito. Jason paused. "We already closed on that land 3 weeks ago," Thomas said flatly, his voice low and tired. "I know, but they're concerned about delays on the permit side." Apparently, the zoning commission... Thomas closed the menu, set it down with a soft click. "Filet, medium rare, and bring the Camus." He spoke without looking up, as if the act of eye contact cost more energy than he could spare. Jason nodded once, typed something into his tablet, then flagged down the sommelier with a quick flick of his wrist. He was efficient like that, always smooth, always discreet. But tonight, even Jason noticed it. The distance. "You've seemed off lately," he said, lowering the device. His tone was cautious, more personal than usual. "I've been working for you long enough to know when something's up." Thomas adjusted his collar with a slow movement, the kind of gesture meant more to buy time than to fix anything. His temples pulsed faintly, like a warning light behind his skin. The pressure was building again. It had been for weeks now. Dull, persistent headaches that came in waves, paired with an exhaustion no amount of sleep seemed to fix. "Stress?" he muttered, reaching for the glass of water. "Doctors say it's stress." Jason studied him for a second too long. "And do you believe them?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the window. Down below, the city moved like a living organism. Horns honking, headlights blinking, people scurrying. It was the same every night. Manhattan didn't rest. It pressed forward, as relentless as its skyline. He used to admire that about it. Now, it just made him feel heavier. The sommelier arrived with the wine, announcing it softly like a secret. 2017 vintage, full-bodied, notes of blackberry and tobacco. Thomas nodded, but didn't care. He only drank red now, because the bitterness distracted from the pounding in his head. As the wine was poured and the cork presented, he felt a sharp tug behind his eyes. He blinked it away. Jason watched, quiet again. He knew better than to push. In truth, he'd seen it coming. Thomas had been different for months, more detached, less reactive, like a man who kept checking a watch that no longer ticked. His empire, once built with the precision of a chess game, now ran on autopilot. He signed documents without reading them, delegated without interest, attended meetings, yes, but never fully present. Still, Jason knew better than to call it out directly. "You sure you don't want me to reschedule the equity summit for next week?" he offered, more gently this time. "You look like hell." Thomas allowed a thin smirk to play at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Always the charmer," he said, then leaned back in his seat, fingers tenting beneath his chin. "Number, keep it. We don't stop." That was always his answer. To everything. They didn't stop. The company, the acquisitions, the meetings. The world didn't stop for anyone, least of all for the man who owned half the skyline. The waiter arrived with their meals. Thomas didn't lift his fork. The food steamed on the plate, untouched, a painting meant to be admired and ignored. Jason tried once more. "If it's more than stress, maybe you should—" But Thomas cut him off without looking. "We'll talk after dinner." Outside, the wind picked up. A light drizzle began to tap against the floor-to-ceiling windows like an impatient child. Inside, Thomas Bradford sat in silence, surrounded by opulence and stillness, in a room full of people who smiled too much and meant too little. The pressure behind his eyes intensified. He closed them for just a second, long enough to feel the ache spread behind his skull like ink in water. He didn't notice the door at the front of the restaurant swing open. Not yet. But someone, was already walking toward him, about to shatter everything. The violinist faltered, just slightly, barely more than a breath. But Thomas heard it. The note hung awkwardly in the air, clipped, as if startled by something it couldn't quite see. Then came the voice of the maître d', tight, embarrassed. Excuse me, miss, you can't—" The restaurant doors had burst open. Not flung, not slammed, just burst, like pressure finally escaping from something small and overfull. The sudden draft carried the sharp scent of wet pavement and something else. Dust, maybe, or sweat. City air clung to the girl who stood blinking beneath the golden lighting, as out of place as a coal smudge on fine linen. She looked 10, maybe 11, thin, rail thin really, with a tangled braid down her back, and shoes that had long surrendered to holes. Her dress, a faded blue cotton thing, hung lopsided, clinging damply to her knees. One sock slouched, the other was missing entirely. Eyes. That was what Thomas noticed next. Big, dark, unblinking. Not frightened, not even shy, just urgent. The room paused for her, held its breath. Conversations stuttered and dimmed. Forks hovered above plates. Even the wine glasses, mid-clink, seemed suspended in an invisible web. She scanned the dining room like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd seen this place before, maybe in passing, maybe through glass. And then she locked eyes with him. Thomas Bradford. There was no mistaking it. She knew who she was looking for. She walked, fast and deliberate, straight toward his table, ignoring the maître d' trailing behind, red-faced and stammering apologies to anyone who would listen. Jason looked up from his tablet just as the girl arrived at their table and stopped. She was breathing hard, but not panicked. Her small hands rested firmly on the edge of the white linen tablecloth, fingertips still damp from the rain. Her eyes didn't waver. "Are you him?" she asked. Her voice was steady, soft, but not timid. "Are you Thomas Bradford?" Thomas blinked once. The room seemed to shrink, not in size, but in sound, in temperature, in the careful, manicured distance that had always kept people like her far from people like him. Jason stood halfway out of his seat. "Young lady, this is a private—" But Thomas raised a hand, just barely, and Jason sat again, frowning. Thomas turned to the girl. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet, and yet the force of her presence had carved a silence through a restaurant full of powerful people. He looked at her closely now. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from being soaked and out of place. Yet her gaze held. "Yes," he said slowly. "I'm Thomas Bradford." The maître d' arrived just behind her, breathless. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Bradford. I'll escort her out immediately." "She's fine," Thomas said, still looking at the girl. "Give her a moment." The maître d' froze, uncertain, then bowed his head and stepped back. A handful of patrons at nearby tables were openly staring. One woman in pearls leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. Another man chuckled under his breath. Thomas didn't care. For reasons he couldn't explain, didn't try to explain, he waved the noise away. The girl drew a breath. "I need to talk to you. It's important." "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily. Lily Carter." The name didn't register. Thomas glanced at Jason, but Jason gave a slight shake of the head. No clue. "And what's so important, Lily Carter?" he asked, still calm, though something sharp stirred in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him like this. Not deferential, not scripted, not rehearsed. Just real. Lily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her shoes squeaked against the polished floor. "My mom works for you," she said. Thomas frowned. "She does. She cleans your house. Emily Carter. She's there Tuesdays and Thursdays." That, he recognized, just barely. A quiet woman, polite. Never lingered, never looked him in the eye. The kind of person whose presence was felt only by the trail of order left behind. Folded towels, fresh coffee, silence. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said. "You've got 1 minute." Lily's lips parted, like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. Her fingers clenched the tablecloth now, leaving damp little crescent moons in the fabric. She leaned forward slightly, not enough to be rude, just enough to show she meant it. "My mum said you take 2 kinds of pills," she said. "Blue ones and white ones." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Jason's did. He shifted again, this time more alert. "She was talking on the phone," Lily went on, "to my aunt. She said you shouldn't take them together, that it's dangerous." She sounded really worried. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but Thomas raised a hand again. The pressure in his head surged, hot and tight behind his eyes. He hadn't told anyone about the mix, hadn't thought it mattered. 2 doctors, 2 prescriptions, 2 different problems. "You heard her say that?" he asked. Lily nodded. "She was upset. Said the white ones mess with the blue ones. Said she didn't know if she should say anything. I told her I would. It was simple. Director. Unadorned. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't asking for anything. Just standing there, dripping onto the carpet, trying to make sure he didn't die." Thomas looked at her a long time. Then, finally, he stood. Jason rose with him, surprised. "Thomas." Thomas didn't answer. He pulled a crisp napkin from his lap, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the untouched fillet. "We're going to the hospital," he said. "To your doctor?" Jason asked. "No." He looked at Lily. "To the ER. And she's coming with us." Lily's eyes widened, just a little. She nodded. Thomas turned to the maitre d', whose jaw had gone slack. "Have my car brought around, now." And then, without another word, Thomas Bradford followed a soaked little girl out of the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, past stares and whispers and silence, chasing something he hadn't felt in years, a thread of truth. The fluorescent lights above the emergency room buzzed faintly, casting a pale, almost clinical haze over everything. Thomas sat on the edge of the hospital cot, stiff-backed in his tailored suit, the jacket folded neatly over his lap like a shield. The hum of machines surrounded him. Pulse monitors, oxygen compressors, intercoms murmuring overhead. And for once, he couldn't pretend he was somewhere else. Lily sat across from him, legs dangling from a plastic chair too big for her, soaked dress still clinging to her knees. She'd refused the nurse's offer of a hospital blanket, insisting she wasn't cold, though her small hands were curled in her lap, white-knuckled. Her eyes, still watchful, flicked from the heart monitor to the IV stand and back again, as if she were trying to decode the mechanics of survival. Thomas noticed that, and he noticed something else. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. "Do you want some water?" he asked, voice low, uncertain. She shook her head. A nurse passed the room with a clipboard. Lily didn't follow her with her eyes. She was too focused on the beeping behind Thomas's shoulder, the numbers blinking green on the screen. He couldn't tell if she understood them or was just pretending to. He felt another wave of pressure behind his right temple. Not the sharp, stabbing kind that made him wince, but a slow, pressing fog, like his thoughts were being pushed underwater. He pressed a hand against his brow. Jason had gone to handle the paperwork. It was just the two of them now. An 11-year-old girl who shouldn't be here, and a man who had never once in his adult life asked for help. Until tonight. The curtain rustled, and a doctor stepped inside. He was older, mid-50s, silver-rimmed glasses, calm eyes. He glanced briefly at Lily, then extended a hand toward Thomas. "Mr. Bradford, I'm Dr. Keene. I've reviewed your test results." Thomas stood automatically and shook the doctor's hand, his grip firm out of habit, not intention. He sat again. Keene didn't sit. He glanced at the monitor, then back at Thomas. "You're on lisinopril for blood pressure, and you've recently started sumatriptan for migraines." Thomas nodded once. The doctor exhaled through his nose. "They don't play well together. You're experiencing a drug interaction, Mr. Bradford. That pressure behind your eyes, the dizziness, the fatigue, it's all classic. Left unchecked, this combination can restrict blood vessels dangerously. You are heading toward a serious cardiac event, stroke in the worst case." The words landed like stones, not dramatic, not cruel, just real. They settled somewhere deep in his chest, too heavy to move. Behind the doctor, Lily didn't flinch. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She just sat there, quiet and still, her expression unreadable. Thomas swallowed. "How long?" The doctor raised a brow. "How long would I have had?" Thomas clarified. Keene didn't answer right away. Hard to say. A week, a month, but the trajectory was clear. Thomas blinked slowly. Not at the doctor. At the wall behind him, where a laminated poster detailed the symptoms of a stroke in bullet points. Confusion, slurred speech, facial droop. He remembered waking up last week with a numb arm and blaming the gym. He shifted on the cot, felt the paper crinkle beneath him. "You'll stay overnight," the doctor continued. "Observation, blood work, then we'll switch your prescriptions. I'll also refer you to a cardiologist who's more attentive." Thomas almost laughed. More attentive was polite doctor speak for less negligent. But the fault didn't lie with them entirely, did it? "No one asked if I was on other meds," Thomas said aloud, more to himself. Keene offered a tired smile. "Most people don't volunteer. They assume doctors already know, but it's always important to say something." Thomas's gaze slid toward Lily. The doctor followed it. "She's the reason you're here?" Keene asked softly. Thomas nodded. Keene turned to the girl. "You did the right thing, kiddo." He stepped forward and gently rested a hand on Lily's shoulder. Most grown-ups wouldn't be brave enough to interrupt a stranger's dinner, especially not someone like this guy. He winked. Lily didn't speak, but something shifted in her shoulders, barely a breath. But Thomas saw it. The kind of shift people make when they're not used to being praised and don't quite know how to receive it. Dr. Keene gave a final nod and disappeared behind the curtain, leaving the silence in his place. A silence that wasn't awkward, but weighty, full. Thomas sat very still. The machine behind him beeped steadily. His blood pressure was coming down. The numbers were better already. But inside, something else pulsed, something he didn't recognize. He looked at Lily. She was watching him now, eyes steady and unflinching. There was no triumph in her expression, just quiet concern, awareness far beyond her years. Their eyes held. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. But his chest rose with something that wasn't pride or relief or gratitude exactly. It was, recognition, of her, of this moment, of the fact that he had no control anymore, and that, for once, that might be okay. For a man who'd spent a lifetime building walls made of money and silence, it was the first crack in the stone. A nurse passed again. Thomas didn't look. Lily turned back to the monitor and watched the numbers blink, and Thomas, for the first time in years, let them. 3 days had passed since the hospital visit, but Thomas had not quite returned to his usual rhythm. He still went through the motions, meetings, calls, reports, but something quite pressed at the edges of his mind, tugging him toward a discomfort he couldn't name. He found himself thinking of Lily's eyes, unblinking in the emergency room, and the stillness in her voice when she said, she was upset. I told her I would. And then, an unexpected incident happened to Emily and Lily. It happened early in the morning, before dawn had stretched its way into the city skyline. A 5-story brick building in the East Village, long neglected and barely up to code, went up in flames. An electrical fault, they said. Or maybe an unattended candle. The truth didn't matter, only the aftermath did. Emily and Lily lost everything. Thomas heard about it from Jason, who stood in the doorway of his office holding a tablet with the live news feed running. It's her building, he said, voice unusually grim. They got out. But it's bad. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared at the footage. Smoke rising against the pale sky, firefighters hosing down what looked more like ruins than anything that had once held a life. He closed his laptop. Get the car. Emily stood outside the Red Cross shelter, wrapped in a borrowed coat. Her hair was damp from the misting rain, and her hands were shoved deep into the pockets, like she was trying to anchor herself to something. Beside her, Lily sat on a low wall, holding a worn backpack that looked like it had been pulled from the wreckage. They looked tired, but not fragile. They looked like people who'd had to keep moving before grief could catch them. Thomas approached without fanfare. No umbrella, no preamble. Emily looked up and offered a faint smile, more apology than greeting. Hi, she said. We're okay. He nodded. I know. Lily looked up. They wouldn't let us get anything. Thomas crouched in front of her, eye level. Things can be replaced. She tilted her head. Even drawings. He paused. Especially drawings. Lily considered that, then nodded solemnly. Thomas stood, looking at Emily now. Where will you go? She hesitated. They're offering a temporary hotel placement. It's not much, just until I can find something else. Maybe a few weeks. No, he said. She blinked. No? You're not going to a hotel. Thomas, my house is empty, he said. Too many rooms, too much quiet. And after the hospital, and now this. This isn't a question. It's an invitation. Emily straightened. I don't want charity. He shook his head once. It's not charity. It's need. I need you there. Both of you. The words came without calculation. They were not rehearsed, not softened. Just honest. That was new for him. Strange. But it settled between them like truth always did. Uncomfortable, unavoidable, undeniable. Emily didn't speak right away. Her eyes flicked to Lily, who was now inspecting a blister on her thumb, completely unaware of the magnitude of the moment. Then she looked back at Thomas. We'd be intruding. You'd be home. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. The drive to his townhouse was silent at first. Lily slept in the back seat, her head leaning against Emily's shoulder. Emily stared out the window, rain slicing across the glass in thin, silver lines. Thomas glanced at her once, just once, but said nothing. At a red light, she finally asked, Why? He didn't pretend not to understand. He answered slowly, Because I know what it feels like to lose everything. Emily looked at him. Really looked. Her voice was gentler now. But you didn't have to come. I did, he said. Not for you. Not just for her. For me. Emily turned back to the window, but this time, her reflection held something softer. When they pulled into the circular driveway, Lily woke with a small gasp. Are we here? Thomas glanced back. Yeah, we're here. Emily Carter stood at the foot of the marble staircase, her arms stiff at her sides, her coat still on. Her eyes scanned the vast entryway as though she were trespassing, even though Thomas had opened the door himself and said, more than once, "You're welcome here." The foyer of Thomas Bradford's Manhattan townhouse was quiet, so quiet that her daughter's sneakers made soft, hollow squeaks across the polished floors. Lily had already wandered a few steps ahead, eyes bright, tilting her head back to take in the vaulted ceilings and the chandelier that shimmered like a frozen waterfall. Emily still hadn't moved past the threshold. Thomas watched her from the landing above. He hadn't meant to stay upstairs. He'd intended to greet them properly, to make things less awkward, but the moment he saw her hesitate at the door, something in him stalled. It was the look in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but caution. Like a person entering a place that could change them, and not trusting whether that was a good thing. I should have come down, he said aloud, though no one could hear him. His voice sounded strange in the silence. Downstairs, Lily wandered into the living room. She stopped in the middle of the oversized Persian rug, turned slowly in a circle, and dropped her small backpack on the floor with a soft thud. Then, without ceremony, she sat cross-legged on the rug and looked up at the towering windows. "It feels like a castle, but empty," she murmured. Emily turned sharply toward her daughter. "Lily," she said, more gently than stern, "take your shoes off, honey, and don't sit on the floor." "It's clean," Lily said, already unlacing her sneakers. "Cleaner than our kitchen." Thomas finally descended the stairs, footsteps echoing faintly. When he reached the bottom, he nodded once toward Emily. "I hope the guest room is comfortable," he said. "It's not much, but—" She glanced at him, then back at the sweeping curve of the staircase. "It's more than we've ever had." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply said, "It's yours. For as long as you need it." Emily hesitated. "This isn't... It's not a pity, is it?" "No," he said. Then, after a breath, "I need you here more than you need me." The words startled her, not because they sounded untrue, but because of how plainly he said them. She studied him for a moment, trying to read between the lines. But there was no calculation in his face, just an odd, quiet sincerity. "All right," she said softly. "We'll stay a few days, until we figure things out." "We." Not I. He nodded. He offered to show them the guest wing, but Emily insisted she'd find it herself. "Let Lily explore," she said. "She's better with spaces than I am." Left alone in the cavernous living room, Thomas stood by the fireplace and looked around. The furniture was immaculate. The art was expensive. Everything had been chosen by designers he barely remembered meeting. He walked slowly to one of the console tables and opened a drawer. Inside, a stack of untouched photo frames, all still with placeholder models smiling into nowhere. He realized, with a mild pang, that there wasn't a single photograph of his own life on display. No childhood memory, no family, not even a company award. Just silence, order, and immaculate taste. Upstairs, Lily's footsteps thudded lightly across the ceiling. Thomas closed the drawer. That evening, he asked the house chef to prepare dinner for 3. Nothing extravagant, just something warm, comforting. He didn't know what comfort tasted like to a child, but stew seemed safe. At 7, they sat at the dining table. It seated 12. Thomas sat at one end. Emily sat halfway down the side. Lily took the seat directly across from her mother, too far from either to touch, but not far enough to protest. No one said much. The utensils clinked against the porcelain. The fireplace crackled softly behind them. Occasionally, Lily would glance down the long, polished table toward Thomas, studying him the way a child observes someone they've only seen from a distance. It was Lily who broke the silence. "Do you always eat alone here?" Thomas paused mid-cut. He looked up slowly, met her eyes. "Yes," he said. Lily blinked. "That's sad." "Lily," Emily said under her breath, reaching for her daughter's hand. But Thomas didn't seem offended. He gave the smallest shrug. "It can be." Another quiet moment passed. Then Lily picked up her spoon and said matter-of-factly, "The soup's too salty." Thomas smiled. A real one. Brief, but real. Later that night, after Emily had tucked Lily into the guest bed and returned to her own temporary room, Thomas walked the hallway alone. The house was still, but not in the sterile way it usually was. There were signs of life now. Small shoes near the doorway, a pink hoodie slung over the back of a chair, a forgotten juice box on the console near the stairs. None of it matched the house. And somehow, that was the most comforting part. In the guest room, Lily had left the light on. A paperback book lay open beside her, the pages lifting gently with each breath she took. From the hallway, Thomas could just barely hear the sound of her steady, even breathing. He stood there a long moment, listening. Then he turned off the hallway light and went to bed, not realizing until his head hit the pillow that, for the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel empty. It felt full. Dinner was quieter than the one before, though not in the same strained way. It was a quiet, filled with small sounds, forks gently scraping against ceramic, the low simmer of something on the stove in the next room, the occasional creak of an old beam shifting overhead. Lily sat between Thomas and Emily tonight, her chair slightly turned so she could see both of them. Her hair was damp from a bath, the ends curling at her shoulders. She hummed as she ate. Thomas noticed it first, not the tune itself, but the absence of silence in her presence. It filled the space differently than voices did. Softer, braver. Emily watched her daughter and smiled, but said nothing. She was still careful with her words around Thomas, like conversation was a fragile vase she didn't want to knock over. He didn't blame her. Lily, without preamble, looked up at the tall windows that stretched above the dining room like cathedral arches. "Do you ever see stars from this house?" Thomas blinked. "What?" She pointed upward with her spoon. "Stars, out there." He followed her gaze to the glass. All he could see were city lights reflected back at them. Manhattan didn't leave much room for the sky. "I guess not," he said after a pause. "Too much light." Lily nodded, her voice matter-of-fact. "In our old place, we couldn't see real stars either, but we had painted ones." Emily's fork froze mid-air. Lily went on, her voice warming. "Mom painted them, on the ceiling. Glow-in-the-dark stars, but not like the sticker kind. She made real constellations. Orion, the Big Dipper, even ones from books we read." Thomas turned to Emily, curious. She was still looking at her plate. "I didn't know you painted," he said gently. Emily hesitated, then softly, "I used to. It's been a long time." "You were good," Lily added. "Even Uncle Paul said so, and he doesn't like anything." Emily smiled faintly at that. "They were just for fun." Lily twisted in her chair. "Can we do it here, on the ceiling?" Thomas looked up. The ceiling above the dining room soared 30 feet high, not exactly ideal for personal projects. "Maybe in your room," he said. Lily's face lit up. Really? He nodded. We have ceilings. We have paint. All we need is someone who knows what they're doing. Emily raised an eyebrow. I don't think I remember how. Thomas leaned back slightly, meeting her gaze. Then you'll just have to learn again. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was there, and it lingered. The next day, Lily dug through the kitchen drawers and emerged triumphantly with a roll of masking tape. To mark the stars, she explained, we'll sketch first, like a map. Emily stood in the hallway, holding a tray of paints Thomas had one of his staff fetch from a local art store. They weren't the kind she used to buy. These were expensive, rich in pigment, sealed in neat little glass jars. The kind meant for people who didn't need to calculate grocery money. Emily looked at them like they were too pristine to open. It's okay, Thomas said, appearing behind her. They're meant to be used. She glanced over her shoulder, a touch of color rising in her cheeks. I just haven't done this in so long. Thomas shrugged. The ceiling's been waiting. Upstairs, Lily had already placed a small wooden stool in the center of the room, arms crossed, surveying the blank space above like a contractor. We'll need a ladder, she announced. Thomas returned 15 minutes later with a 6-foot stepladder and a smile that surprised even him. Permission to enter the construction zone. Lily nodded seriously. Granted. They worked for over an hour. Emily penciled faint outlines onto the ceiling while Lily read aloud from an astronomy book Thomas hadn't known they owned. She sat cross-legged on the bed, dictating positions, while Emily added soft strokes of color. Cool blues, soft whites, the occasional dab of silver. At some point, Lily climbed the ladder herself, a glow-in-the-dark star in one hand. She tried to stick it just above the closet, but even on her tiptoes, she couldn't reach. Thomas stepped forward. Need help? I want to do it myself. I know. He crouched slightly. But maybe we do it together. She looked at him, then handed him the star. He lifted her with both hands, slowly, carefully, her small frame light in his arms. She reached up and placed the star with delicate precision, pressing her palm against it for a beat longer than necessary. When he set her down, her smile was quiet but unmistakable. That evening, Thomas turned off the lights in Lily's room. At first, there was only the dim city glow leaking through the windows. Then, gradually, the ceiling above them came to life. Hundreds of painted stars and glowing specks forming constellations that danced across the plaster in soft luminescence. Lily gasped. It worked. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide, head tilted back. They're beautiful. Thomas stepped back, watching both of them. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Lily climbed into bed, curling beneath the blanket, her face still lit by the stars. Can you stay for a minute? He hesitated, then nodded. Just a minute. Emily didn't move either. She stretched out beside Lily, fully clothed, arms behind her head. Thomas lowered himself to the floor beside the bed, resting on his back. The three of them stared at the ceiling in silence. The room was dark, but not empty. The kind of dark that holds warmth, like a theater after the curtain falls, but before the lights return. Lily yawned. Emily blinked slowly. Thomas let his eyes drift upward to the glow that seemed impossibly still. A small hand reached down from the bed, brushing against his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He stayed there, grounded beneath a sky someone else had made, in a room he hadn't known could feel like home. In that quiet beneath stars they had built together, Thomas Bradford felt something shift. It didn't need a name. It just needed to be real. Rain came softly that morning, tracing long, trembling lines across the tall windows of the townhouse. The sky above Manhattan was a dull slate grey, and the usual hum of the street below seemed gentler, like the whole city had taken a breath it didn't quite know how to release. Emily was folding laundry in Lily's room when she found it. A stack of loose papers, printed in the school's standard template font, folded in half and shoved between a workbook and a glitter-glued folder. The first line caught her eye before she could stop herself. "My Hero," by Lily Carter. She sat on the edge of the bed, reading slowly. Her fingertips smudged the ink at one corner, but she didn't move. The words were simple, stitched together with the logic of a child. But what caught her off guard was the quiet weight of them. By the time she finished, her hands had stilled completely. She looked at the paper a moment longer, then smoothed the crease, refolded it, and walked downstairs. Thomas wasn't in the living room, nor the office. She finally found him at the breakfast table with a black coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked up when she entered, surprised to see her holding something with such care. She placed the folded paper on the table in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "Just something I think you should read." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out with the same quiet firmness he'd come to recognize as her default when something truly mattered. He waited for a beat before unfolding it. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat out of habit, though no one was there to hear. His eyes scanned the first line. "Some people think heroes have capes or superpowers, but I think heroes are people who listen. Not everyone listens. Not really." He stopped. Outside, a car splashed through a puddle. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked on, unbothered. He kept reading. "My hero is Thomas Bradford. He's very rich, and everyone listens to him. But one day, he listened to me. Even when no one else in the room thought I mattered, he listened and went to the hospital. And that's why he's still alive. I didn't save him. He saved himself, but only because he chose to listen." The words blurred slightly. He blinked, but didn't wipe his eyes. He didn't move at all. He hadn't cried in over a decade. Not when his father died. Not when his company went public. Not even when he first realized he was alone. But this caught him off guard. Not because it was grand or poetic, but because it was plain, honest, undeniable. "Heroes don't always fix everything. Sometimes they just stop and look and hear you. That's enough." Thomas let out a breath, long and unsteady. He folded the paper again, carefully this time, and sat back in his chair. The silence in the room was different now. He rose, walked to his office without knowing why, and closed the door behind him. The room was as it always was, cold, curated, hollow. The kind of space built to project control, not comfort. He sat at the edge of his desk, the essay still in hand, staring at the blank wall ahead. A knock came at the door. Not urgent, just present. Jason stepped inside. "Got a moment?" Thomas nodded, still holding the folded paper. Jason paused, studying him. His voice softened. "You okay?" Thomas looked up. His eyes were slightly red, and for once, he didn't bother pretending otherwise. He held the paper out, silently. Jason took it, read it slowly. His face didn't change much, but his shoulders shifted a little. When he reached the last line, he exhaled through his nose. "She gets it," he said. Thomas let out a quiet, surprised sound, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "She does," he said, "more than I ever did." Jason set the paper down gently. "She wrote that for school." Thomas nodded. "Didn't tell anyone?" "Of course not." Jason was quiet for a moment. "You want me to frame it?" Thomas blinked, and for a second, the idea almost made him smile. "No," he said. "Not yet." Jason nodded, then turned to go. But before he left, Thomas spoke again. "I don't think I've ever really lived," he said, voice almost too low to hear. Not until she walked into that restaurant. Jason lingered in the doorway, hands in his pockets. He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was simple. Then maybe that was the beginning. Thomas sat alone after that, his fingers resting on the folded essay like it was something fragile, something alive. He didn't reread it. He didn't need to. The words had already settled inside him, quiet and sure. He stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out a heavy leather-bound planner, last year's edition, already obsolete. He slipped the essay between 2 pages near the back and closed it gently. Then, as if by instinct, he made his way upstairs. Lily was in her room, lying on her stomach with colored pencils scattered around her. She was sketching stars again, this time on paper, not the ceiling. She didn't look up when he knocked softly on the frame. "I found your essay," he said. Her pencil froze. Slowly, she looked up. "I didn't mean for you to read it," she said quickly. "I mean, I was going to show it to Mom, but—" "It's okay," Thomas said. "I'm glad I read it." She watched him, uncertain. He stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. "You called me a hero." "Well, yeah. I'm not." Lily tilted her head. "You don't have to be everything. You just have to care." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, the way her hair curled at the edges, the way her eyes held too much understanding for someone so young. He thought about all the things she'd seen, all the things she carried, quietly. "I'm trying," he said. "I know," she replied, without hesitation. He stood and turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back. "You saved me." Lily smiled. "Good," she said, "'cause I kinda like having you around." That night, when Thomas walked through the hallway, he paused at Lily's door again. The stars above her glowed softly, casting pale green light on the walls. Her breathing was slow, steady. The essay was tucked away now, hidden in a planner no one used anymore, but its words echoed with him, still, quiet, resilient, undeniable. And in their echo, Thomas Bradford felt not heroic, but human. The morning was still dark when Thomas pulled out of the garage. No driver, no schedule, just him, behind the wheel of a grey sedan that blended into traffic like it had something to prove. A baseball cap pulled low, a sweatshirt zipped halfway, and his phone silenced in the cup holder beside a lukewarm coffee. He wasn't drinking. He drove west, through the narrow arteries of the city, watching the skyline dissolve into stacked brick and faded murals, into neighborhoods the news only mentioned when things went wrong. He didn't tell Jason where he was going. He didn't bring a notepad or a camera crew. He wasn't here to inspect. He was here to see. At a 4-way intersection, the traffic light flickered yellow as he slowed. A boy, maybe 7, stepped off the curb holding the hand of a younger girl. She wore mismatched boots and a pink backpack, far too big for her frame. The boy held his arm out instinctively, shielding her from a passing van. Thomas stopped, watched. The boy never looked up, never waved a thank you. He just walked, head down, hand steady. The girl skipped beside him like it was a game. When they were gone, Thomas exhaled and drove on. The street narrowed. Fences leaned into the sidewalks like tired men. A basketball hoop clung to a rusted pole, net long gone. There were murals on the walls, bright colors fading into brick, portraits of men with halos, and words like hope, rise, belong. He parked near a corner store and stepped out. It was early, but already kids were gathering in front of a closed community center, kicking a deflated soccer ball between cracked tiles. No one noticed him. He was just another stranger in a city full of them. A girl about Lily's age sat on the stoop beside a laundromat, coloring on the back of a paper grocery bag. She paused to wipe her nose with her sleeve, then went back to sketching. Stars, maybe. Hard to tell from here. Thomas took it all in, the broken pavement, the laughter, the quiet resilience, and felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't guilt, not anymore. It was responsibility, the kind you didn't outsource. He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. The boardroom buzzed before he entered. 12 chairs, 11 men, 1 woman, all polished, all waiting. His seat at the head of the table sat untouched, a legal pad placed neatly before it, as if anyone thought he still used it. "Morning," he said, taking his place. Jason sat to his right, silent, but watchful. The meeting opened with projections, quarterly reports, and market trends. The usual numbers, flat, precise, numbing. Then came the objections. "You're seriously moving forward with this?" asked Harris, a man who'd worn the same style of tailored suit for 20 years and still flinched when people used the word affordable. "We're not a charity, Thomas," added Ronkin, adjusting his cufflink like it was part of the argument. Thomas didn't flinch. He turned his laptop toward the screen behind them and clicked to the first slide. It wasn't a chart. It wasn't a rendering. It was a photo. Lily, in her room, sitting cross-legged on her bed, head tilted back, looking up at a ceiling full of hand-painted stars. The glow cast soft shadows across her cheeks. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open in quiet awe. A few murmurs. Someone shifted in their chair. Thomas stood. "I used to think that too," he said quietly. "That profit was the only marker of success, that if we hit our numbers, we were doing our jobs." He clicked again. A satellite image of the neighborhood he'd driven through that morning appeared. Rows of run-down housing, a shuttered school, a patch of green, overrun with weeds where a playground used to be. "Then I realized something," he continued. "Most of what we build doesn't serve the people who need it most. It serves those who already have options." A long pause. "Sometimes, profits aren't the thing to be most proud of." No one applauded. That wasn't the kind of room this was, but no one interrupted either. That, in itself, was something. Weeks later, a quiet transformation began. In a forgotten corner of the city, an old lot was cleared. No press release, no groundbreaking ceremony. But by the second week, workers were planting trees and sanding down rusted swings. The city hadn't authorized anything. They didn't need to. The land was privately owned by Bradford Development, and Thomas had signed off without fanfare. When Emily saw the report on the local news, "Small park restored in West Bronx," blinking across the screen, she called him into the living room. "Is this you?" she asked, one brow raised. Thomas shrugged. They needed somewhere to look up at the stars. Emily didn't say anything at first. Then she smiled. Not the polite kind. The kind with teeth and memory and warmth. "You're changing," she said. "Trying." Lily, curled up beside her with a blanket, grinned. "You should name the park after someone." "Who?" Thomas asked. Lily shrugged. "Maybe someone who listens." Back in his office one evening, Thomas sat alone. The plans for the affordable housing development were laid out in front of him. Floor plans, elevations, community spaces, low-income units mixed with market rate, solar panels, walkable access to transit. He'd gone over every detail, asked questions the architects weren't used to hearing. The legal team had sent over the final draft. He reached for a pen. Not the Mont Blanc executive roller on his desk, not the stylus for his tablet. A fountain pen. Heavy, brass, worn at the grip. A gift from his father, long forgotten at the back of a drawer until last week. He opened the cap slowly, dipped the nib in ink, and signed. The stroke trembled slightly. Not with hesitation, but with weight. He leaned back, watching the ink dry. It wasn't just a project. It was a promise. That weekend he returned to the neighborhood. The playground was open now. Kids ran across the mulch, barefoot, laughter bouncing off the chain-link fences. Parents leaned against the walls, watching. A young man strummed a guitar beneath the trees. Thomas stood at the edge of the sidewalk, unnoticed. A boy darted past, chasing a ball. Another helped his sister up the slide, hand firm on her back. It was small. Just a park. Just one block. But it was a beginning. Thomas stayed a few minutes longer, then turned to go. Behind him, a woman called after her child. A bell rang from the corner store. Somewhere nearby, a mural was being repainted, and the city, slowly, was becoming something new. Not because of headlines or deals, but because one man, quietly, deliberately, had chosen to listen, to stop, to see, and to act. The air inside the townhouse had shifted. It wasn't colder, just quieter in a way that felt unsettled, like something unspoken had begun to stretch itself across the rooms, restless and waiting. Emily stood by the window, mug in hand, untouched tea cooling, as she watched Lily in the courtyard below. The girl was chasing leaves, laughing at the way they danced along the stone path. Autumn was soft this year, brushing against the city instead of slamming into it. Thomas was reading at the kitchen table. Or pretending to. The newspaper hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. Emily spoke first. "I think it's time we move out." The words weren't sharp, not even abrupt, just gently firm, as if she'd been carrying them in her mouth for days, waiting for the right moment to let them go. Thomas looked up. "Move out?" She turned from the window, nodding once. "Lily's starting to call this place home. She called the guest room hers yesterday, and when she drew our family for school, she put you in it." He blinked slowly. "I don't see the problem." "She's confused, Thomas, and I don't want her heart breaking if this turns out to be temporary." His voice dropped. "It's not temporary." She crossed her arms, leaning against the windowsill. "But it feels borrowed, and I need to teach her not to live on borrowed things." Thomas stood, not rushed, but deliberate. He walked to the edge of the counter, one hand resting flat against the marble, like he needed its solidity. "You're not borrowing," he said. "You're not guests." Emily offered a soft smile. "We don't belong in this world." "Yes, you do," he said, almost before she finished. "Maybe more than I do." She looked at him, really looked, and for a second, he didn't feel like the man who owned this building, or the man who built entire blocks from scratch. He looked like someone afraid of losing something that made him feel real. He walked around the counter and stopped in front of her. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask this, and I'm not good at these things." He swallowed, hands loose at his sides. "But I want you to stay. Both of you." She shook her head gently. "Thomas." He cut her off, not with force, but with a quiet edge of desperation. "Not because I need a cleaner, not because Lily brings life to this place, but because I need you. I need you both." Emily's eyes flickered. "I've spent most of my life believing no one could get close to me without wanting something, and I was okay with that. Until you two walked in and didn't want anything at all. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a transaction." There was a long silence between them. Emily's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can be what you need." Thomas didn't step forward. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, stripped of everything he'd once thought made him valuable. "You already are," he said. Stillness. Then from the hallway came the soft patter of feet. Lily peeked in, clutching a sheet of paper in her hand. "Mum?" Emily turned. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily held up the paper. "I drew the stars again, but this time I added a moon, because I thought maybe the sky was missing something." Emily crouched, pulling her daughter into a hug. "The sky's never missing anything when you're under it." she said softly. Lily beamed, then looked at Thomas. "Are we still staying for dinner?" Thomas glanced at Emily, then back at the girl. "I hope so." Lily nodded. "Good, 'cause I already told the stars." She vanished back down the hallway as quietly as she'd come. Emily stood slowly. Her eyes found Thomas's. Something in them shifted, loosened. She reached out, not fully, just enough. Her fingers brushed his hand, a simple human touch. Thomas didn't move, but his hand turned, palm up, to meet hers. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. Instead, she nodded once, slow and certain, and squeezed his hand gently. It wasn't an answer. It was the beginning. 1 year later, the house no longer echoed. It breathed, not through grand gestures or renovations, though there were new things, a patchy garden out back, a string of paper stars hanging in the hallway, a scuffed rug Lily had spilled orange juice on, but through sounds, signs of life. Laughter in the kitchen, socks left under the coffee table, music, sometimes off-key, drifting from Emily's old speaker. The air itself had changed, warmer now, as if the walls had softened from watching love grow inside them. In the kitchen, chalk dust clung to the corners of a blackboard by the fridge. It listed the week's essentials. Monday, Emily's soup night. Tuesday, Lily waters the herbs. Thursday, pizza night, no olives. At the bottom, in Lily's careful looping handwriting, someone had added, "Every day, don't forget to look up." Thomas had written the line beneath it. Already did. She smiled back, in white chalk, subtle, but unmistakably his. He was in the garden that morning, kneeling awkwardly in the dirt, squinting at two nearly identical herbs. Emily appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, coffee in hand. "You're about to confuse the mint with the cilantro again." Thomas didn't look up. "I wasn't going to pick either. I'm just observing." "Mm-hmm." She stepped onto the patio. "You realize you could have someone else plant and label these for you." "I know." "So why are you out here every morning with a trowel and your executive kneeling mat?" He looked over his shoulder, deadpan. "Because apparently, watching things grow teaches patience. That's what your daughter told me." Emily grinned. "Smart kid." "She really is," Thomas murmured. The rosemary had survived, the basil hadn't. In the upstairs office, a painting hung above the desk. Not a real painting, not in the traditional sense. It was a watercolor on construction paper, slightly warped from too much glue. The figures were childlike, drawn with bold strokes. 3 people beneath a navy blue sky filled with stars. 1 tall man, 1 woman with curly hair, and a girl with her arms raised to the sky. Each had been labeled in uneven block letters, me.mom.thomas. He had framed it in dark wood and hung it himself, right above where the company's 40 under 40 plaque used to be. He never talked about that decision, but one morning, Jason walked in, glanced at the wall and said, "Better company." Thomas hadn't disagreed. That evening, they celebrated his birthday. For the first time, not with catered trays or champagne flutes, but with Lily's homemade spaghetti and a lopsided chocolate cake. Thomas entered the dining room to find candles flickering, and Emily in an apron, cheeks flushed from the heat of the oven. Lily sat at the table, bouncing slightly in her seat, holding a card behind her back. "No presents," Thomas said instinctively. "You don't get to make the rules," Lily grinned, handing him the card. "Open it." He did. The front was blue construction paper with a silver star glued off-center. Inside, in bright marker, it read, "To the best listener in the world. Happy birthday. Love, Lily." He blinked once, then folded it slowly and placed it beside his plate. "You okay?" Emily asked gently. He nodded. "Just, not used to this." To birthdays? To being known. Later that night, long after Lily had fallen asleep with frosting on her nose and a new book in her lap, Thomas sat in his study, fingers resting on the leather cover of a notebook he'd never intended to use. It had been a gift from a developer, too ornate, too polished, embossed with gold lettering. It had sat untouched on his shelf for years, reserved for a future that always seemed too full for reflection. Now, it was nearly half filled. He flipped to the last page, clicked his pen, and wrote slowly, "Lily didn't just save my life. She gave me a reason to live." The ink bled slightly on the curve of the G. He didn't mind. He closed the book. There was no ceremony, no need. Just a soft exhale, the scrape of the chair as he stood, and the distant sound of Emily and Lily's laughter echoing from the garden, lit now by low-hanging string lights and the pale glow of a moon just rising. Thomas opened the back door. The night air met him like an old friend, familiar and full of promise. Emily looked up from the bench, raising her eyebrows. "Did you finish writing whatever secret thing you've been scribbling every night?" "Maybe," he said. Lily stood beside her, holding a mason jar with a firefly trapped inside. She ran to Thomas, held it up. "Want to let it go with me?" He nodded. "On 3. She grinned. 1, 2. They opened the lid. The light drifted upward, slow and aimless, then blinked once before disappearing into the dark. "Where do you think it goes?" Lily asked. Thomas looked at her, then at Emily, who was watching them with a warmth he still didn't fully know how to hold. "Hopefully," he said, "where it's needed most." Lily smiled and leaned into his side. He rested a hand on her back. No contracts, no declarations. Just breathe. And presence. And the quiet truth of a house no longer echoing, but humming softly with something real. A home, a family, 3 people, and the stars.